Hello, and welcome to the All Things Narrative podcast, where we explore the relationships between the stories we love and the stories we live. I'm your host, Derek Hatch, and let's get started. All right, we're back at the top of the month of July, and it is so good to be here with you all. Thank you so much for tuning into this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And I'm excited because I have someone very, very, very special on, all the way from the other side of the world that I get to bring on here. And so we are going to be interviewing the one and only David Denborough himself today. I'm just so excited that you are here for this. Before we get started, just a reminder that at All Things Narrative, if you want to get more connected with us, you can like us on, social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, all that good stuff. We're there. You can check out our website, allthingsnarrative.com. And yeah, feel free to reach out, say hi, send an email, connect, leave a review. It's been so encouraging to hear from some of you, and I'm glad that you're enjoying this podcast. And it's just good to be doing this and to be bringing narrative practices out to a lot of people who have told me that they don't really know what narrative practices is, and they're learning through this podcast, which is really cool. So I'm excited about that, and thank you for tuning in. So who I have on here today is somebody who is largely responsible for bringing narrative practices out into what we know it to be as today. And he's done that through a lot of ways. So David Denborough works as a community worker, teacher, and writer-editor for the Dulwich Center, which is located in Adelaide, Australia. He's particularly interested in cross-cultural partnerships which limit the chances of psychological colonization and create possibilities for cross-cultural inventions, such as the team of life narrative approach and the tree of life. These collective narrative methodologies seek to assist people to address the effects of traumatic experiences without having to speak directly about them. David is also vitally interested in how collective narrative practices can spark and or sustain social movement, and in projects that respond to racism and seek to strengthen social cohesion/inclusion. Recent teaching and community assignments all around the world, including Brazil, Palestine, Singapore, Austria, Hong Kong, Iraq, India, Canada, Sri Lanka, Argentina, Chile, South Africa, a number of Aboriginal Australian communities, and pretty soon Rwanda, the host of the 2022 Narrative Therapy and Narrative Practices Conference. And he's also the coordinator of the Masters of Narrative Therapy and Community with the University of Melbourne, which is where I met him, as David helped supervise us in the graduate program with our innovation projects and beyond. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you all today here on the All Things Narrative podcast, David Denborough. Welcome.
Hi, Derek. Your enthusiasm is just delightful, and I feel energized all the way over here on what is a cold Adelaide morning, but somehow I've been warmed. I've been warmed by your podcast already. So very, very nice to be here with you.
Oh, well, thanks. Some of these sessions during the master's program, it was 9, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night over here on the East Coast. And you had just a way of keeping us going, you're just the way that you teach. It's just so, it's interactive, but it's also like there's a narrative, like a storytelling dimension to it, just as you drew us into those moments of teaching in the way that you would challenge us to practice as well. So glad I could reciprocate that.
Well, I think it was reciprocated during that program too, because one of the things I love about the masters and all the different training programs we try to be involved in is that the participants are coming not just to learn about what narrative practice already is, but to contribute to expanding it. So you and all the other folks in your year as you were doing your innovation projects, that was really enlivening for us because, you know, people taking these ideas and yes, there's a long history now of a lot of different engagements and the field that already exists, but so exciting to see what people do with them and in the collaborations in all these different contexts. And you and everybody in your year, keep expanding this field, keep finding ways to respond to different social sufferings in different contexts. And that does require a bit of energy, a bit of innovation, and lots of partnerships.
Yeah, and that's what was really cool about that program, is that encouraging of innovation. And with 60 or so people in the program, nobody had the same project. Like, everybody was doing something different that related to their own context and practice. And so it's cool to get to see what people are doing around the world with narrative practices. And I'm sure, by your experience, you've seen a lot of things. And what I'm kind of curious though about to start is, how did you get into this world? Where did your love and your passion and your innovation, for all things in narrative practice, where did that start?
Well, Derek, we have to go way back in time to think about that, back to the early 90s. It's a bit of a tale, and it's quite nice thinking back to them, because they were times where I was just really, really stretched and really searching too, I guess. As a young guy, I'd finished school, and by the time I was really pretty disillusioned with mainstream dominant Australian culture, white Australian culture, but also masculine culture. And I just, I was pretty despondent in some ways. I had many really great experiences at school. I know you work within schools and alternative schools, and I'd been good at the things you were meant to be good at. So I'd been, successful at dominant culture and dominant masculine culture. But by the time I finished school, I was feeling just bereft about what that sort of trajectory meant. Also, in terms of a middle-class white masculinity in Australia, it's pretty fraught. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. What were you studying at the time?
Well, I finished school and I didn't know what to study. Okay. So, in fact, I was really just thinking about being a musician. So I took a year off and I found a real solace and meaning and different company in worlds of music. But I'd also grown up in a household that had shown during the Cold War, because things were pretty terrifying back then in terms of the possibilities of nuclear war. And both my parents had not just faced the horrors of that possibility, but they really took action. So they, both fantastic people, and they'd formed what started as a grassroots movement. And at those days, the peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement was absolutely thriving. Hundreds of thousands of people at marches, and they then formed a political party called the Nuclear Disarmament Party to try and bring changes in Australia. So at the same time as this disillusionment with dominant culture, I did have this, I'd seen the possibilities of people trying to come together and take action. So I guess I was just searching for all those realms. And eventually I ended up I remember the day, actually, what was one of the turning points before I knew anything about narrative practice, but it made it all possible, really, was I was just trying to read everything I could about gender and masculinity, and I just came across some of the early women's liberation writers, including Germaine Greer here in Australia, and their styles of writing, which were so personal but political and engaged, and naming, the desolation of dominant culture, but being on fire, trying to change it. There was something about their writings that just strangely, even though my context was very different, but their writings about gender just made so much sense. So was that really that then made me think, okay, well, try to take some action in these realms. What would that look like? Mm-hmm. And so, joined with others to try and do something about men's violence, and also by a circuitous route, ended up working in prisons. Mm-hmm. So, but, it's a long answer to your question, but I wasn't looking to be a therapist. Mm-hmm. I was studying social work. That then meant that I could try and explore these different realms. And by the time I was then trying to work with young men and work in prisons, and I was just reading everything I could about masculinity. Mm-hmm. And then I remember the day there was a welfare worker in the prison. Her name was Charlene. I can't remember her second name. Mm-hmm. But she passed me this newsletter from Dulwich Centre. Mm. It was a Dulwich Centre newsletter on men's ways of being. And I read it, and I realised it was the only thing I'd ever read that was put together by men and women working together in relation to a gender partnership, cross-genders partnership. And it was just so exciting. The enthusiasm you had in your voice at the beginning of this podcast, I had throughout my being when I read this newsletter. It was like, oh my goodness, I've been reading things everywhere else. And this was just invigorating in terms of both the content and the possibilities of partnership that it represented.
That's like how I felt when I read the very first book I read on narrative practices was actually your book, Retelling the Stories of Our Lives. And when I opened to chapter 1, and I want to read this quote because I don't think I've shared this yet on the podcast, and it's just a phenomenal quote. And you wrote in here, who we are and what we do are influenced by the stories that we tell about ourselves. While we can't always change the stories that others have about us, we can influence the stories we tell about ourselves and those we care about. And we can, with care, rework or rewrite storylines of identity. When I read that, I was like, okay, I found my place. Like I found the type of the literature, the reading that I need for my life. So in regards to like that quote, how did you, as you began to read from the Dulwich Center, as you were reading these writings about masculinity that were informed by men and women that were in collaboration, and as you were learning more about these narrative ideas and that framework of rewriting storylines of identity, what did that look like in your work in the prisons?
Well, the first things that was happening in the prisons, I was just learning so much. I was so out of my depth. I mean, I come from this middle-class white family, very loving family, and was suddenly being introduced and taught about a whole different side of this country, this continent that I lived on. It was, I just had a chance to have the most honest conversations that I'd had about a whole lot of things with the men who were in prison there. And it was like a really vibrant but challenging education. It was a different university. And there were so many moments that took place. Some of them I remember. There was a young Aboriginal man about the same age as me at the time. His name was Todd. And he was the first person to tell me, that in his worldview, I was a gubber. I was a white fella. And suddenly I was trying to think, okay, well, wait a minute. I need to be understanding my life in terms of being a white fella. What does that mean? What is becoming a gubber or becoming white fella from his terminology? Seeing my life through his eyes. Yeah. And then there was... I also then, while I was there, started to realise how many of the men had been through boys' homes and had been through juvenile justice. And while they didn't talk openly about it, there was just acknowledgement between us that sexual violence, rape and assault had been such a part of their lives as kids and as young people, and just complete cultural silence about it, but how pervasive this was, and trying to think about what that meant in terms of, my understanding of the country. And same in terms of class. I was in the first, I'd been asked by these men who were all doing serious time if we could organise something that would support them to then work with young men back in their communities when they got out. That was what they wanted to do. And there was no course or training that we had in the prison that they thought could assist them. So they asked, can you create something? So it was such a fantastic invitation. I was like, well, yeah, we've got to try and do that. So, this was the first course that I was a part of trying to create with them. And it was going to be like a welfare course, but we had to obviously do it completely differently because no existing course actually was resonant. So we eventually, I'd come in with a particular topic. It was like sociology in some ways. How had, say, issues of class affected their lives and how it affected my life and how different was that? And then we just talk about that or about race or about sexuality. We'd have these conversations and then they were just incredibly interesting and challenging. And one guy I remember saying to me, well, actually, I think I posed the question first. I said, look, when I was growing, in high school, I would have called you Westies, which was like the term for people from working class backgrounds in the west of Sydney. And I said, I would have thought you were, stupid and potentially violent. And what would you have called me? So they said a squarehead. And I'd never heard the term squarehead. I knew the term Westie, but I'd never heard the term squarehead. So I said, what would you mean by that? And they said, stuck off poof who can't fuck. So I don't know if you got a language warning on your podcast, Derek, but anyway.
It's okay.
And it was like, okay. And it wasn't these conversations, they weren't, it wasn't a time for me to be offended or a time for this. It was actually an invitation to partnership. We were actually talking honestly across these differences, and I was getting an education about, what does it mean to be a squarehead? I hadn't, in all my earlier training, I hadn't learned about what it meant to be a gubber or what it meant to be a squarehead. And here I was learning about this, and they were fantastic conversations. And in terms of what this meant in terms of narrative practice, which was your question.
Before you say that, it's just so important just to acknowledge here that, a lot of people in this situation tend to just come in and be like, okay, I know exactly what these people need, so I'm going to just, give it to them and do it. But I feel like what you're really exemplifying here is you took time to listen to them. You took time to understand, to enter into their world. And you had said earlier, like, to see you from their eyes and to take their, like, the ideas that they had for, wanting to create a group where when they got out, they could go and talk to the young men in their community, and being able to acknowledge and do that. I mean, it sounds like there was a sense of agency that maybe they were experiencing when they were with you, that they could talk freely and openly about these things where maybe they hadn't always had that opportunity before.
Well, I mean, I was 23 and from a white middle class background, never been in prison, never been in juvenile justice, never been in children's homes. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing, but I guess I did at least know that I didn't know what I was doing. There was like when you were saying if I could bring what would be, to tell these guys what to do. The one thing is they wouldn't have done it; they would have just resisted. Yeah. And the other thing was I did recognise that even in the moments of, if people were telling me to being pretty direct with me that I was doing something incorrect. It was a chance to learn something, and we could be in it together. So there was a generosity from those men. Wow. That was significant to me. But the other thing was, it just became so clear that what they wanted to do was to offer something back to the young, particularly the young men in their communities, to prevent them from living the same sorts of lives that they'd lived and doing the same sort of harm that they'd done to others. And in terms of where narrative practice fitted in, I suddenly realised that, they didn't have freedom of movement, but I actually was going into the schools where the young men that they wanted to have an influence with were, because I was doing that as part of this other group that I'd formed to try and meet with young men to prevent violence. Mm-hmm. And so years later, in terms of collective narrative practice, and I now talk about, enabling people to speak through me, not just to me, this was really where I learnt that, because I realised that these men, I could say, well, look, I know you want to offer something back to these young men and try and see if there's some way to avoid the harm that's been done, including the harm that these guys had done. And I'm actually going into this high school next week. Do you want to send some sort of message to them?
Yeah.
And that just made things possible. So we could talk about... I could interview them. I don't know how we got permission, but we got permission to make little videos back then. And I could interview them about masculinity, about sort of ways of being a man that they'd been invited, recruited, then stepped into. Mm-hmm. And I remember one of them said, those ways of being a man, they were like a scholarship to nowhere.
Mm. Wow.
And... I've been reading everything I could about, gender and masculinity, but actually this was the best description I'd ever heard, a scholarship to nowhere for these young men, many affected by poverty and by racism. Yeah. And then they'd step into these dominant ways of being men, and they said, it took us, we started doing this, then we took this step, and then it was like we stepped right into these ways of being men that have ended up us doing harm to others. Yeah. Ending up in prison. And we don't want these other young men to take this scholarship to nowhere. Don't take this scholarship to nowhere. So anyway, I could film that with their permission, and then go into the schools and use this as a bit of a spark, bit of a starting point to deconstruct masculinity, really, and try and explore and support alternative ways of being. So that was, and they were the first projects really where I was trying to use narrative practices and learning an enormous amount along the way from both the guys in the prison and the young folks in the schools.
So when you went to the schools and you brought these videos to the students, what were their responses?
Well, you would know more than most, Derek, but sometimes when you're meeting, high schools, and I was always asked to go out to the, schools that were in strife, and then the particular classes where there'd been a lot of trouble, and it's often year 9 boys, young men that I was being asked to meet with. Mm-hmm. And, it's somewhat chaotic, which I'll enjoy. Chaos going on in the room, even getting people's attention can be a bit of a struggle, but it made a difference when I could say, look, I've just been at Long Bay Prison this week, and the men there wanted to send you a message. In fact, they've made this message for you. Would you be interested in hearing that? Mm. And so I realised that, again, it wasn't me that people wanted to talk to necessarily, even if we did have good conversations. But they did want to have a chance to contribute to or be linked with others who might have been through similar lives that they had been. So that, the group, there'd be silence. Suddenly there'd be this different sort of silence in the room, and I'd be able to share this piece, and then I could ask them, well, what do you want to say back to these guys who just sent you this message? And the men in the prison particularly wanted to hear, were there ways that the young men were resisting this scholarship? were they wanted to hear about, ways that they were trying to be different sorts of men. Often the young guys would talk about being yourself rather than being a man. It was their sort of terminology. So I could ask them questions about, well, how are you doing this? And what are the effects of the, being tough or being cool, which were the other words back then. What were the effects of those on your life, on your relationships with your sisters and relationships with the girls in school? And we could have all these conversations, and I could take some notes and write up some message to send back to the men in the prison. And I was like a go-between in some ways. I was using narrative practice skills in my questions, in rescuing the words, but it was all in service of trying to facilitate links between people who all wanted to make some changes to some broader social issue, which I did too. In this case, that broader social issue was about dominant masculinity and the harm that it does to women, kids, and to men. So that was, I just learned a lot in there that has continued to shape my interest in narrative practice, because I'm not a therapist, not a counsellor, but wanting to find ways to address different social issues and find ways to bring people together to be able to do that. And that context in the prison and in the schools was like a crucible of learning for me.
There's a fair amount of people who listen to this podcast that are narrative practitioners or interested in narrative practices. But there's also people that don't know a lot of these words and concepts. So I heard you mentioning collective narrative practices earlier. So could you tell us a little bit more about what those are?
Sure. Well, narrative therapy as a field forever has never really separated the therapy from community work. So Michael White was also involved in community projects as well as being a family therapist, a narrative therapist in the counselling room. So there's always been this real interest in how can learnings from one realm influence the other. And if we're really looking at how broader issues are affecting lives in the therapy room, are there also ways of trying to respond to them more broadly? So collective narrative practice, it just takes that a bit further. So in externalizing conversations, we say that the person's not the problem is the problem. And, we just also think in collective narrative practice, well, person's not the problem is the problem. And the solution is not only personal. So we're trying to think, if people, whether it's in therapy, whether it's in schools, whether it's in prisons, they're actually really not just representing themselves, not just representing personal experience, they're also representing social issues, social problems, social injustices. So that means that I think we've got a responsibility as practitioners, not just to be working in the realm of personal experience, but also thinking how can we contribute to addressing social issues, not just replicating the status quo, but trying to influence some of these broader social harms. And it's a big topic because there's quite a critique of therapy and counselling and psychology and social work over many decades, saying that sometimes all these professions can actually personalize or look for personal solutions to what are political and social problems. And so collective narrative practice is trying to sit right in the middle of that dilemma, that critique, and think, okay, so if we're receiving stories of social suffering, social injustice, people are coming to us to try to transform their personal experience of those.
Mm-hmm.
So we do want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, maybe that's not enough.
Yeah.
Maybe we also need to be trying to think how we can at least not get in the way of broader social change, but hopefully also try to contribute to it in some way. So that's where the field of collective narrative practice comes in. It's got quite a long history, and it's also got to do with, how can we make our work most relevant to the most marginalised, sort of that ethic. So lots of contexts, people aren't going to be going to counselling, aren't going to be seeking a therapist, or aren't going to be able to afford to, or are in cultures where that's not a resonant idea.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, our job as narrative practitioners, again, often through partnerships, to think about, okay, well, how do we need to transform our practices, create ways of working that will be relevant to the most marginalised, and that can try to respond to and try to create some sense of social movement, not grand social movement, but some sort of social movement in relation to these social issues. So that's the sort of place that collective narrative practice fits in. And the story I gave before about finding ways for folks in prison, young men,
mm-hmm.
shaped by gender partnerships, shaped by the influence of feminist women, and in conversation with feminist women with whom I was at the time, but try to contribute to creating some different possibilities in relation to dominant masculinity and addressing issues of gender injustice. So, that's sort of where that fits in.
Yeah.
And we have to be a bit creative. We have to come up with whatever will work in a particular context.
And that's something that you talk about you have a book called Collective Narrative Practice, and it's a fantastic book for those of you out there who haven't read it. And one of the things that you bring up in that book is this idea of folk culture. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about what folk culture, how that plays into collective narrative practice, and the kind of creative ways that you find to engage a group of people who maybe don't want or don't have access to traditional modes of therapy and counseling?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of different ways that can work, but we're really trying to find whoever we're working with, maybe talking directly about their lives in the first person, which is sort of expected to do in sort of therapy or counseling.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's going to be the last thing they're going to be wanting to be doing. That's lots of the contexts I work in, that's not really a very good fit. So, but there might be some aspect of local life for them that they do find sustenance in, or they do find easy to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just interested in looking for those moments, those elements of local culture. So in prisons, talking in the first person about your life is often not a great idea, because it can make you more vulnerable. And so, if you spend a lot of time in institutions, then you spend a lot of time learning how not to speak in the first person about your life. So, but songs are, a treasured aspect of prison resistance culture. So in the prisons, we hold group discussions. Be my job to, with permission, take a few notes and do what we call rescuing people's words, not rescuing the person, but if the person says something that's really significant, to try and make sure those words can have a longer life. So, and in my experience, when we're meeting with people, often I'll say a phrase that could easily be a lyric, could easily be transformed into the song. So within the prisons way back then, that was also my job, to try and create some songs with the folks I was working with. And there was one with transgender folks in the prison that was one of the first songs of this kind that we created together. It's called A Song of Survival. And there was another song I remember writing from the words of a man who was HIV positive and knew he was going to die behind prison walls, and what different meanings that brought to life. So this was a way of then, working with an aspect of folk culture, in this case songs, honouring people's words and insider know-how, and then in some small way creating art, recording it, and then it could be played through the cell blocks. That's sort of one realm of engaging with local folk culture.
So when you would talk to somebody about their life and you would rescue their words, you would try to accurately write down their words, and then would you take those words and create a song out of them?
Yeah, I would, and then I'd bring back the draft version and play it and see if people liked it. And if they did, if they wanted to be part of the recording, or if they wanted me to just record it, if they want it just for them, or if they wanted it shared with others. And sometimes they wanted these broadcast.
Was there a particular time, like a particular interaction that you can recall that was really maybe particularly meaningful or special to you, or memorable in any way?
Well, because we're talking about those times, I mean, there have been lots over the years, but because we're thinking about those prison times when it was the song of the transgender folks who wanted their song of survival played in the prison. There was one time when we could do this. They didn't want to actually perform it, but they wanted, I was part of a band at the time, and they wanted our band to come in and play it on World AIDS Day.
Wow.
So we got permission to do that, and we cranked it up to 12 and played Song of Survival and introduced it and what it meant. And these folks, I don't know what it's like these days in the US, but transgender folks in prisons not only are vastly overrepresented, of course, First Nations folks in Australia are vastly overrepresented and experience mass incarceration of the sort of scale that happens in your country. And transgender folks also vastly overrepresented and endure indescribable experiences, really, some of these folks have been through. But the song that they wanted sung was also acknowledging that, but it was also acknowledging that this was a song of survival that they had endured. So when this was broadcast to the whole prison, when we performed this, and then it didn't stop the continuing injustices they were experiencing, but it did broadcast a different storyline, a different sense. And that was certainly one time that, although it was many years ago, I still remember it.
Yeah. And did you continue having conversations with them, even after your band played that song in the prison?
It was an unusual time because there were a number of transgender folks in that prison at one time, and then they often would get dispersed. So it didn't that sense of communitas or solidarity didn't necessarily last for so long. But we produced a book called Treat Us Like Queens, actually, that came out that was then shared around the prison too. But I stopped working in prisons after it was only about 3.5 years that I was there. I had my own sort of personal crisis and left Sydney, and eventually via Canberra moved down to Adelaide to work at Dulwich Centre, where I still do now. So it was just a moment in time, really. But the idea of engaging with folk culture, that's really continued, and songs is just one element. Whoever's listening here, you might not be so engaged in music, but there might be some other aspect of folk cultural life that you're engaged with. And I used to think that I'd have to choose between being a musician or being a social worker or working, with issues of injustice. And I just realized you don't have to they're false distinctions.
Wow.
We can bring them together. Yeah. So certainly my life's been more meaningful for being able to bring them together. There's another aspect of folk culture, though, that I should just mention, because sometimes it's also with, you mentioned earlier the Tree of Life approach, which was developed with Ngazela Nkube Malilo at her invitation in Zimbabwe. We worked on that together to try and think what would be a relevant way of working for kids there in Zimbabwe who'd lost a great many loved ones due to HIV/AIDS. And again, they weren't going to want to talk about this directly. In fact, when they did, Ngazela noticed that sometimes they'd have more nightmares or wet the bed more that night. So it was Ngazela's idea to try and think, well, we could combine something they were already doing, which was drawing trees and linking this to aspects of their identity, but we could combine that with narrative practices. So that's how the Tree of Life narrative approach came about. So it's like using a metaphor, some aspect of local folk culture, in this case, trees and forests and storms, and talking about our lives through that metaphor. And then similarly, the Team of Life uses football metaphors, and the Recipes of Life uses cooking metaphors, and the Smartphone of Life from Chris in Hong Kong talks through smartphones, and basically thinking anything that the people we're working with that they're really interested in, that they can have a long conversation about, well, maybe we can use that as the starting point for our practice. Maybe we can go where they're comfortable rather than getting them to talk where we're comfortable.
Yeah, these various of life metaphors have been huge in teaching. When I teach students, if I have a group of students that are musicians, great. The soundtrack of life. I mean, everyone I know loves the soundtrack of life, even if you're not a musician. But Tree of Life, Team of Life, Recipe of Life. They're all Journey of Life. Another favorite that I do with people. These are fantastic. And one of the things that I'm really I've been wrestling with in the last couple months in particular, and this is kind of what you were making me think of when you're talking about leaving the prisons, is how to, because folk culture is something that we're not necessarily bringing in. It's something that's already there. It's with the people. They're interested in it. Being able to cultivate a community that continues those things, even when us, the narrative practitioners, aren't present, because I just, in the last few weeks, as I'm recording this, I transitioned from the job that I've been in for the last 7 years. And so one of the things that's really been on my heart in the last, few months, as I knew this was coming, was, okay, when I leave, are, my students who are still going to want to be doing drumming and music, are there going to be people there who are going to carry that, who are going to continue that? And trying to find ways as narrative practitioners to, we don't want a culture of people to be dependent on this only happens if I'm there, and if I'm not there, it doesn't happen. Trying to be no, listen, I don't have to be there. This is something that you guys are more than capable of doing and being leaders at, and being able to empower people to take the lead on that. So I think that's so important to be able to do, but it's something that maybe I know I'm guilty of not always thinking about in the moment when I'm with people. So,
no, I think that's really crucial, and also reminds me of a different aspect of collective narrative practice, which is in a paper called Linking Stories and Initiatives, which was really trying to say that sometimes we would get invited. As often I say we, it was a team. Auntie Barbara Wingard and Cheryl White and I often were the nucleus of the team, and we've been invited to try and meet with a community that was going through some strife.
Yeah. And
yes, there's no way that we could bring solutions, and any attempt to would be, just risking imposition and colonial imposition. Mm-hmm. So the task was quite different. It was to try to make visible what initiatives were already taking place in those communities, either to respond to so many losses that were going on, address different hardships. And these initiatives are always happening, but they might just not be acknowledged, might not be visible. And we could convene local rituals to make these more visible. We could document them, and we could share them then between communities. So there'd be these exchanges of stories that while we would write them down, we would actually just read them aloud in the second community. And then we'd be facilitating these exchanges between communities to do sort of what you were talking about. It's to foster and any sort of embers that were just flickering in these communities to try to blow some, I think Talia Drum Butler used that metaphor, to then blow some air onto these embers so that these local initiatives would become more widely known, and communities could make contributions to one another. So that's another key aspect that you reminded me of, Derek, which is what is our role to be decentered but influential in these forms of community or collective practice.
Yeah, that's good.
Things that no woman should ever see. I felt things no person should feel, and my spirit within these walls will live forevermore, and in the hearts of those who truly love me, I'll be forever free. This is a song of survival. This is a song of survival. Well, sure, some of them don't treat us like royalty, but some of us know how to act like queens, and we'll forever be. This is a song of survival. This is a song of survival. She knows where the strength comes from.
So once you get to Dulwich, what's your role start looking like there?
Well, my first role was quite a wonderful one. So Cheryl White really invited me to be a staff writer. So whenever we would notice initiatives that were happening in the field, to go and assist in writing them up. And the first major assignment, though, was again in relation to prisons, because there'd been a community project called Reclaiming Our Stories, Reclaiming Our Lives, which was when Tim Aegis from the Aboriginal Health Council approached Dulwich Centre to respond to every Aboriginal family in the state of South Australia who'd lost a loved one to death in custody. There'd been a big inquiry here about that. So after that project finished, Tim Aegis and others were like, well, this prisons isn't just an issue that affects Aboriginal people, actually. It affects this whole country.
Yeah.
So could you put something together about that? So Cheryl asked me to put together, it was meant to be a newsletter. Cheryl was very kind, because I kept writing and it eventually turned into a book called Beyond the Prison, Gathering Dreams of Freedom. So it was like searching for ways beyond the prison, alternative responses. And that took me to your country, Derek, for the first time. I travelled to the US, and it was an extraordinary trip. I, first of all, in Colorado, through a friend, was able to visit a supermax prison, most devastatingly dehumanizing place I could ever imagine.
Wow.
But even in there, managed to witness the ways that the folks were resisting. And then I went to this conference, which was a pretty strange experience, where everyone stood up for the American anthem and different things that didn't usually happen in Australia. But in that, I'd also heard of this work that was happening in New York. And it was a non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice by Eddie Ellis and others. And so I then traveled to New York and interviewed them about the work that they were doing, and also met a guy called Stephen Donaldson, who was one of the first people that I'd ever known who'd been raped in prison and then would speak publicly about it. He was an amazing man. He would create small audio tapes in those days.
Yeah.
You probably never even saw any of them, Derek, but there were these audio tapes. You put cassettes
like
into
cassettes.
tape recorders.
Oh,
A cassette, that's right. So, okay. Anyway, so he would make recordings on these audio cassettes to support other men and women who had been sexually assaulted in prisons, and he would send these via the post across the US, an organization called Stop Prisoner Rape. So I met these folks doing just both the work of Eddie Ellis in New York and Stephen Donaldson and others, taking these initiatives in the face of great hardship. And my job was to write them up and share them with others. It was a most wonderful role.
Yeah.
And so that was my first role. So I loved it.
And how long ago was that? How many years ago?
I think Beyond the Prison came out in 1995.
Okay. So you've been at Dulwich for roughly, at least like more than 25 years.
Yep.
Wow. So what are you really focused on there these days?
Well, right at the minute, Derek, you mentioned it at the beginning. We are really looking forward to this conference that's going to take place in Rwanda. For quite some years, we've been learning with Rwandan narrative practitioners. It's a big story in itself, but we've planned this conference for quite some years, and COVID got in the way. You read out that list of places where I'd been teaching recently. That needs updated because everything had been via Zoom for the last 2 years. Anyway, but Rwanda, it's going to happen. We're going to make it to Kigali.
Yeah. And
it will be a context where Rwandan and other East African narrative practitioners share their work with the wider narrative therapy community. So it's going to be great, Derek. It's going to be great. But that's a bit of a focus.
Awesome. So if somebody wanted to learn more about this conference and the work that's going to come out of it, what's the best place they can go?
They can just go to the Dulwich Centre website, dulwichcentre.com.au/conference. You could find out about that there. We're going to also be video recording the conference and then we'll have some events after the conference where we will share those. In fact, we're thinking of inviting people, if they want to sponsor one Rwandan to come to the conference, then that will also then enable them to come to these virtual events later on and meet the practitioners and watch the videos. And so we're going to find ways for the international audience, because of course so many people who would like to be there who aren't going to be able to be there. That would be true even if it wasn't in the pandemic. It's even more the situation now. So we'll find ways to make sure there's many sharings from that event.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So as we're getting ready to wrap up this episode, one of the things that we talk about on every episode is this idea of living a meaningful story. So we talk about that we don't just tell stories. There's stories that we're living every single day of our lives. And we talk about this idea of meaning, of meaning making in narrative practices. What does it mean for you, whatever that looks like, to live, a meaningful story, a life that gives you, a sense of purpose, a life that you're living the preferred narrative, even if, whatever situation you're in, being able to, kind of like what you were sharing, these stories of survival. How do we have a perspective on our lives and our story that empowers us and telling it, as, Auntie Barb says, in ways that make us stronger. For anyone who's out there listening, and people could be in all different stages of life, Is there anything that you'd want to say, any wisdom, anything at all that you'd like to say just about what it means to pursue a story that's meaningful and life-giving to them?
Oh, Derek, I think all I'd say is that, it's just me as an individual talking to you today. Mm-hmm. But what's been by far the most meaningful for me is when I read that newsletter, and it was a gender partnerships that had made it possible, this idea of partnerships, of teamwork, that it would be possible to be part of collectives to try to respond to social issues. That's why I then moved from Sydney and Canberra to Adelaide to be part of these partnerships, to be part of teams, to be part of collaborations where we could do these things together. So that's what gives me the greatest meaning, that I'm part of these collectives, these long-term meaningful partnerships across real differences. The Just Therapy team from Aotearoa, New Zealand, talk about these partnerships, cross-cultural and cross-gender partnerships, and they're also, profound friendships, and that's what's life-giving and meaningful to me. Yeah. And of course, I've just been chatting to you as me here, but it's my engagement with those collaborations and partnerships and collectives that give my life purpose and meaning and joy and challenges and all of the above, and all of that enthusiasm that you demonstrated at the beginning of this podcast. That's what gives it to me to be part of these collaborations. So
that's awesome. And if I can ask you as well on that note, as you're hearing these stories and you're working in a lot of settings like prisons that can be they can be challenging, I'm sure, at times. And some of the stories that you're hearing, what keeps you going? What sustains you through all that?
I have a friend called Dr. Abdul Ghaffar Stanigzai. He's a Afghani human rights worker and medical doctor who had to flee Afghanistan and come to Australia because he was documenting abuses of not only by the Taliban, not only by the Afghan government, but also by foreign forces. And so he can't do the work that he once did, which was responding to these human rights abuses. He's no longer in a position to be able to do that work. Yeah. He's making a new life and doing different things, doing wonderful projects with Dulwich Centre Foundation still, but he's not actually able to do that same human rights work that he was. And whenever he gets to hear about how our team, or that I'm having a chance to try and respond to current social sufferings, he just always says, "You are so lucky. You are just so lucky to be able to be joined and be doing this work," and clearly sees this as sees it for what it is, to be able, there's such suffering and horrors in the world, to have a chance to be able to join with others and respond in some way collaboratively, that is itself profoundly sustaining. And I always just hear his voice if anyone asks me that sort of question. It's like it's his voice that I hear. It just says, even if it's been a long day or there's a complex scenario or anything else, he's just like, "You are just so lucky to be able to be doing that work." And I agree with him. I agree with him. So many people have to, in situations where they can't. So, he's a great guy. You could have him on your program at some stage. He's doing a great project in relation to Centrelink depression, the depression that comes to refugees when they have to constantly engage with welfare services. And so,
that'd be awesome.
He's a great guy too.
Yeah. Well,
thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed talking with you very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you, David. It's been an honor to have you on here. And if you want to learn more about David's work, you can visit the Dulwich Center website, which we'll have a link to that in our show notes. You could also read one of his several books. I recommend Retelling the Stories of Our Lives, Everyday Narrative Therapy to Draw Inspiration and Transform Experience, if you want to begin to get familiar with some of the ideas we talked about here. His book, Collective Narrative Practice, is another great book I highly recommend. And and it was just so good to have you on here. And just thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for a word that came to my mind with all this, just as you were describing being in the prisons and then being in Dulwich and continuing to be in these spaces is faithful. Just being able to continue to show up day in and day out, and give what you have, while remaining decentered. That's no easy task. So thank you for the work that you do. And thank you for, passing on that wisdom, through things like the master's program.
Thanks, Derek, and good luck with your podcast. A great initiative. I've enjoyed being with you.
Thank you so much. And for everyone out there, thank you so much for tuning in to the All Things Narrative podcast. If you want to learn more about workshops, where I'm trying to do these collective narrative practices and trying to figure out how to do it best, for your group, maybe even who's listening, just feel free to reach out at allthingsnarrative.com. And thank you again, and we'll be back next week for another exciting episode. This is your friendly narrative practitioner, Derek, signing off, saying thank you and take care.